The world remembers the photographs, the flashbulbs, the incandescent smile that could stop traffic on a Tuesday afternoon. It remembers the whispers of presidents and playwrights, the titans of industry who circled her like planets around a dying sun. But history has a habit of looking at the brightest light and missing the shadow it casts. So how, then, could the most desired woman on earth, a global icon at the absolute zenith of her power in the late 1950s, become so paralyzed with fear, so crippled by self-doubt, that she couldn't summon the will to walk from her dressing room to a camera just 50 feet away? The answer wasn't in the White House, or in the script from a powerful producer. The answer was a quiet, unassuming woman in a plain black dress, sitting just out of frame. She was the one person Marilyn Monroe couldn't say no to. This wasn't mentorship. It was the most sophisticated form of mind control Hollywood had ever seen. The story begins not with a fall, but with a victory. The year was 1955. Marilyn had done the unthinkable. She had gone to war with a major studio, 20th Century Fox, and she had won. Tired of being typecast as the dumb blonde, she had fled Hollywood for New York, armed with a newfound hunger for legitimacy. She founded her own company, Marilyn Monroe Productions, a revolutionary act for an actress of her time. She was no longer just a star. She was a mogul, a businesswoman taking control of her own destiny. The world was at her feet, and for a fleeting moment, she held all the power. But insecurity is a strange and persistent poison. Despite her commercial invincibility, Marilyn felt like a fraud. She craved the one thing money couldn't buy and contracts couldn't guarantee: respect. And in the hallowed halls of mid-century American theater, respect had one address: the Actors Studio on West 44th Street. It was the temple of the method, a revolutionary approach to acting that promised emotional truth over technical perfection. It was presided over by its high priest, the formidable and intense Lee Strasberg. To be accepted by Strasberg was to be anointed as a true artist. Marilyn, the biggest movie star in the world, became his most devoted and most terrified student. She would sit in the back, shrouded in a coat and scarf, desperately hoping to absorb the genius around her. It was here, in this crucible of artistic ambition and psychological excavation, that she found more than a teacher. She found the woman who would become the architect of her final years. She wasn't a glamorous actress or a charismatic intellectual. She was Lee's wife, Paula Strasberg, a former character actress of little note, a woman described by nearly everyone as plain, stern, and perpetually unimpressed. Paula was the gatekeeper. While Lee held court, dissecting performances with surgical brutality, it was Paula who managed the acolytes. She was the quiet administrator of her husband's kingdom, the one who navigated the fragile egos of actors like Marlon Brando and James Dean. And in Marilyn Monroe, she saw something more than a student. She saw a vessel, a chaotic, brilliant, and profoundly broken vessel that she could fill. Paula didn't offer Marilyn acting notes at first. She offered something far more potent. She offered validation. And as the months bled into one another, as Marilyn's studies deepened, a strange new protocol began to form, an invisible wire of communication that stretched from the hallowed halls of the studio to the boardrooms of Hollywood. Studio executives and powerful directors, men who commanded armies of technicians and millions of dollars, soon learned a terrifying new secret. If you wanted Marilyn Monroe on your set, you didn't call her agent. You didn't even call her husband, the celebrated playwright Arthur Miller. You had to call Paula, and you had to be prepared to pay her handsomely. It began subtly. Paula was hired by Marilyn Monroe Productions as an acting coach, a salaried employee. Her official role was to help Marilyn prepare, to be a creative support system on the grueling sets of major motion pictures. The initial salary was $1,500 a week, a substantial sum for the era. But as Marilyn's dependence grew, so did Paula's price. By the filming of The Prince and the Showgirl, her fee had ballooned to $25,000 for the picture, plus expenses. This was more than many of the film's supporting actors earned. She had transformed herself from a teacher's wife into an essential and highly paid piece of the Marilyn Monroe machine. Her presence was a source of profound confusion and frustration for everyone she worked with. Sir Laurence Olivier, the titan of the British stage and Marilyn's co-star and director on the film, was aghast. He would give Marilyn a piece of direction, and before she would even attempt it, her eyes would dart to the shadows where Paula sat, waiting for a nod of approval. If the nod didn't come, Marilyn would refuse. The director's authority had been rendered meaningless. There were two directors on set, the one who was hired, and the one who held Marilyn's psyche in the palm of her hand. This dynamic played out on film after film. Paula became a permanent fixture, a dumpy woman in black, as one crew member described her, a shadow that followed the sun. She would sit for hours, silent and unmoving, her gaze locked on her prize. When Marilyn faltered, when her notorious lateness and anxiety brought productions to a grinding halt, it was Paula who would go into the locked dressing room. Sometimes she would emerge minutes later with a compliant, ready-to-work star. Other times, she would emerge and announce that Miss Monroe is not feeling creative today. She was the sole conduit, the only one who could interpret the oracle, and the entire multi-million-dollar industry had no choice but to wait for her pronouncements. Everyone saw Paula as Marilyn's emotional rock, the one person who could navigate the labyrinth of her fears and deliver her to the set. The studios paid her because they believed she was the solution to the Marilyn problem. But they were mistaken. They failed to consider a far more sinister possibility. What if she wasn't calming the storm? What if she was the one seeding the clouds, creating the very anxieties that only she, in her unique position of trust, could then appear to soothe? The mechanism of control was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. It centered on a devastating cycle of validation and withdrawal. Imagine the scene, the set of 1956's Bus Stop. Marilyn, under the guidance of director Joshua Logan, delivers a take that is, by all accounts, breathtaking. It is nuanced, heartbreaking, and technically flawless. Logan is ecstatic. The crew is moved. He yells, "Cut! Print it! Marilyn, that was magnificent!" But Marilyn doesn't hear him. Her gaze is fixed on the ever-present chair in the shadows. She is searching for one thing: Paula's approval. And if Paula offered nothing, no smile, no nod, just a blank stare or a subtle, dismissive shake of the head, the world collapsed. Marilyn's confidence would shatter instantly. "No," she would cry, her voice trembling. "It wasn't right. I can do better. I have to do it again." The director's praise was worthless. The crew's admiration was meaningless. The only reality was Paula's judgment. And so they would do another take, and another, and another, for hours. Productions would hemorrhage money. Schedules would fall into chaos. All because one woman in the corner refused to nod. This wasn't coaching, it was conditioning. Paula was systematically severing Marilyn from every other source of professional validation, until she, and only she, remained. The star who had once bravely taken on an entire studio was now reduced to a state of near-total dependency, unable to trust her own instincts, her own talent, or the judgment of her acclaimed directors. She had become a ghost in her own life, puppeteered by an invisible string. Her phenomenal talent was still there, but it could now only be accessed with Paula's permission. The psychological dependency was absolute, but the chain of control may not have stopped there. Did the manipulation turn physical? Did it infiltrate her very bloodstream? The evidence is fragmented, buried in sealed records and whispered anecdotes. But a terrifying picture begins to emerge from the haze of history. Private letters and recently unearthed medical documents suggest that Paula Strasberg eventually took control of something even more intimate than Marilyn's career: the powerful cocktail of medications that governed her waking and sleeping hours. Marilyn Monroe's reliance on barbiturates to sleep and amphetamines to function was one of Hollywood's worst-kept secrets. Doctors, eager to please their famous client, prescribed them with alarming frequency: Nembutal, Seconal, Amicretal, a lethal alphabet of sedatives that promised escape from the crushing pressures of fame and a lifetime of trauma. But as Paula's influence solidified, a new protocol was established. According to several of Marilyn's nurses and personal assistants from this period, they were given strict instructions. They were not to give Marilyn her medications directly. Instead, the pills, the powerful chemicals that could induce sleep or create a state of artificial alertness, were to be handed over to Miss Strasberg. Paula became the dispenser. She was the one who decided when Marilyn was too agitated and needed a downer. She was the one who determined when she was too groggy and needed an upper to make it through a photo shoot. She held the keys not just to Marilyn's confidence, but to her consciousness. The power was absolute. With a handful of capsules, she could make Marilyn functional or non-functional at will. If a producer crossed her, if a director questioned her authority, Marilyn might suddenly become too unwell to appear on set for days. She had become the gatekeeper to Marilyn's reality. But one person saw the dynamic with horrifying clarity. One person recognized the danger and tried to sound the alarm before it was too late. Her husband, the brilliant and formidable playwright Arthur Miller, was not fooled by Paula's quiet facade. He saw her not as a coach or a confidant, but as a parasite. In his private journals, he raged against her, calling her a vampire who was feeding on Marilyn's insecurities, a professional sycophant who profited from keeping his wife in a state of perpetual crisis. He tried to fire her. He tried to sever the toxic connection. The resulting battle wasn't for Marilyn's career. It was for her soul. And it was a battle that Arthur Miller would lose. The final, brutal showdown occurred in the blistering heat of the Nevada desert in 1960, during the notoriously difficult production of The Misfits. The film was Miller's creation, a deeply personal script he had written as both a showcase for his wife's dramatic talents and a desperate, last-ditch effort to save their crumbling marriage. It was meant to be their triumph, a testament to their love and artistry. But from the first day of shooting, a familiar shadow fell across the set. Paula Strasberg was there, her salary paid by Marilyn's production company, her presence non-negotiable. The tension was unbearable. Miller, the celebrated intellectual, found himself in a power struggle with a woman he considered a charlatan. He would watch in silent fury as Paula would pull Marilyn aside after a take, whispering into her ear, undoing the work he and director John Huston had just done. The set became a battlefield with two warring camps. On one side was Miller, Huston, and the professional crew, trying to make a movie. On the other was Paula and her sole, traumatized constituent, Marilyn. They were two opposing forces, pulling the most fragile star in Hollywood apart at the seams. In his memoirs, Miller would later write of his complete and utter helplessness. He described confronting Marilyn, begging her to see that Paula was destroying her. He pleaded with her to understand that the constant need for Paula's approval was a sickness, an addiction that was robbing her of her autonomy and her sanity. He gave her an ultimatum. It was him or her. A choice had to be made. In a screaming match filled with years of resentment and pain, Marilyn gave her answer. She could not, would not, work without Paula. She needed her. It was the final blow. The marriage was over. Arthur Miller, the great American playwright, had been defeated. He left the production before it was even finished, returning to New York, a broken man. Marilyn had made her choice. She had chosen her shadow over her husband. Paula Strasberg's victory was total. With Miller gone, there was no one left to stand between Marilyn and her Svengali. No one left to question the whispers in her ear. The final, most destructive phase of their relationship was about to begin, a terrifying descent into paranoia, isolation, and addiction from which there would be no escape. The stage was being set for her final performance, and Paula Strasberg was now the only one in the director's chair. But what does a director do when their only star begins to break down completely? When the instrument they play so masterfully starts to splinter and crack? Do they protect her, or do they simply find a new way to use her? This is the question that haunts the final 2 years of Marilyn Monroe's life. Because with Arthur Miller gone, the nature of the control shifted. It deepened. It became something far more clinical, more insidious. The director in the chair was no longer alone. She had found a partner. His name was Dr. Ralph Greenson, a prominent Los Angeles psychoanalyst to the stars. On the surface, he was everything Marilyn needed, a respected, fatherly figure who promised to help her navigate the treacherous landscape of her own mind. He was introduced to her in 1960, just as her marriage to Miller was imploding. He was meant to be her savior. But in the twisted ecosystem that was Marilyn's life, saviors and predators often wore the same face. Paula Strasberg and Dr. Ralph Greenson quickly formed what can only be described as a terrifyingly effective alliance. They were the two pillars of Marilyn's new reality. It was a perfect pincer movement on her psyche. Paula managed the external world, the scripts, the studios, the public appearances, and the constant emotional validation Marilyn craved. Dr. Greenson, meanwhile, managed the internal world. He delved into her deepest traumas, her anxieties, her very sense of self, and, crucially, he took over the management of her medications. The doctors who had once prescribed Marilyn's pills were pushed aside. Now all prescriptions flowed through Greenson. The barbiturates that put her to sleep, the amphetamines that woke her up, was all under his purview. And who was the person who administered these carefully prescribed doses? Who was the one to hand Marilyn the glass of water and the pills when Dr. Greenson wasn't there? Paula Strasberg. The circle was now complete. One diagnosed, the other dispensed. One analyzed the crisis, the other orchestrated it. They had become the co-authors of her life, and she was no longer allowed to see the script. This new dynamic had an immediate and catastrophic effect on her career. In 1961, she was cast in what would be her final, unfinished film, a comedy ironically titled, Something's Got to Give. The studio, 20th Century Fox, was banking on her. They needed their biggest star to deliver a hit. But from the very beginning, the production was a disaster, plagued by Marilyn's absences. The official story, the one that has been cemented in history, is that Marilyn had become impossibly unprofessional. She was too sick, too erratic, too broken to work. But was she, or was her illness being managed? Look closer at the records. On days when Marilyn was scheduled for a difficult scene, or when a studio executive she disliked was on set, she would suddenly be declared too ill to work by a stern-faced Paula. A phone call would be made to Dr. Greenson, who would then professionally validate the diagnosis. Marilyn was suffering from anxiety. She had a sinus infection. She had a recurring fever. She needed to rest. Production would grind to a halt. The studio would lose hundreds of thousands of dollars. Yet on other days, she was brilliant. On the days she did show up, she was often luminous, hitting her marks, charming the crew, and proving she still had the magic that made her a legend. The inconsistency drove the studio mad. They couldn't understand it. Was she sick or wasn't she? The truth was, she was whatever Paula and Greenson needed her to be. Her fragility had been weaponized. It was the ultimate power play. By controlling Marilyn's ability to work, they controlled the entire multi-million-dollar production. They held the studio hostage, and their motives may have been chillingly simple. Follow the money. Paula Strasberg was now earning a salary of over $5,000 a week to be Marilyn's coach, an astronomical sum for the time, more than most doctors or lawyers. Dr. Greenson was charging her for near-constant analysis, sometimes holding sessions multiple times a day, at his full hourly rate. They were both profiting handsomely from a crisis they had every incentive to prolong. A healthy, independent Marilyn Monroe didn't need a full-time acting coach or a psychiatrist on call 24/7. But a fragile, dependent, perpetually unwell Marilyn? She was a goldmine. The control became physical, territorial. Dr. Greenson's influence grew so immense that he effectively moved into Marilyn's life. He convinced her to buy her final home in Brentwood, partly because it was close to his. He would spend hours there every day. He dictated who she could and could not see. Old friends, people who had known her for years, were suddenly deemed unhealthy influences and were cut off. Pat Newcomb, Marilyn's fierce and loyal publicist, frequently clashed with the Greenson-Strasberg regime, finding her access to her own client blocked. She saw what was happening, that Marilyn was being deliberately isolated from anyone who might offer her an outside perspective. Marilyn's world shrank until it contained only a few key figures: Paula, Drive, Greenson, and his family. He encouraged her to spend time with them, to see them as her surrogate family, further blurring the lines between patient and doctor, reality and therapy. She was living inside a psychological terrarium, with every element of her environment carefully controlled. They told her she was sick, and so she was sick. They told her she couldn't trust anyone else, and so she didn't. Her paranoia, once a symptom of her trauma, was now being actively cultivated. It was a tool to ensure her absolute loyalty. But did Marilyn ever try to fight back? Did some part of her recognize the bars of the gilded cage that had been built around her? There are whispers, fragments of stories from her final months, phone calls made in secret to old friends, like the actor Peter Lawford. In these calls, she sounded terrified. She spoke of being watched, of her house being bugged. She talked about secrets she knew, dangerous secrets about powerful men. She was planning to hold a press conference, she said, to tell all. Was this just paranoia, fed by her doctors and her medication? Or had she stumbled onto something real? We know that Marilyn Monroe had affairs with both President John F. Kennedy and his brother, Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy. We know the FBI and others were monitoring her. In the fraught atmosphere of the Cold War, a movie star with intimate knowledge of the president's life, who was also psychologically unstable and under the influence of a psychiatrist with potential ties to the émigré psychoanalytic community, she wasn't just a celebrity. She was a potential national security risk. And this is where the story takes its darkest turn. What if Paula Strasberg and Ralph Greenson weren't just financial opportunists? What if their control over Marilyn served another, more powerful interest? Imagine you are a powerful figure who needs to control Marilyn Monroe. You need to know what she knows, who she talks to, what she's planning. You couldn't get close to her yourself, but you could get close to the people who had complete access to her mind, her home, and her medication. The people who saw her every day, her coach, and her doctor. Suddenly, their actions take on a new, more sinister light. The isolation wasn't just about dependency, it was about quarantine. Cutting her off from friends wasn't just about control, it was about stopping the flow of information. The constant medication wasn't just about treating her anxiety, it was about keeping her sedated, confused, and manageable. Were Paula and Dr. Greenson acting on their own, or were they taking direction? Were they merely the wardens of Marilyn's prison? Or had they been hired by someone else to keep the star witness silent? This is the abyss that opens up when you look at Marilyn's final months. The evidence is, by its very nature, gone. It exists only in the spaces between official reports, in the redacted lines of government files, and in the fear that flickered in Marilyn's eyes during her last public appearances. Paula Strasberg, the quiet woman in black, the acting coach who just wanted to help her student find her truth, was now at the center of a web of unimaginable complexity. She had started by controlling Marilyn's confidence, then her career, then her medication. But in the end, was she controlling Marilyn for herself, or for someone far more powerful, hiding in the shadows of American history? The final act of Marilyn's life was not a simple tragedy of addiction and depression. It was a political thriller, and she was the only one who didn't know she was the target. And at the heart of that thriller was a small, red book. Marilyn kept a diary. Friends and confidants knew of its existence. It wasn't just a place for her feelings, but a meticulous record of conversations, a place where she allegedly jotted down pillow talk secrets from the most powerful men in the world. Things the president told her about Cuba, things the attorney general told her about the mafia. She called it her Book of Secrets. And on the night she died, it vanished. It wasn't logged into evidence. It was never found by police. So who got to it first? Was it her trusted coach, her ever-present doctor, or someone else entirely, sent to retrieve the one piece of evidence that could bring down a presidency? But what if Marilyn's diary wasn't the only secret book being kept about her life? Because there is evidence to suggest that Paula Strasberg was keeping her own meticulous records. Not a diary of feelings, but a logbook. A detailed account of Marilyn's treatments, her private conversations, her moods, and the precise dosages of every pill she was given. Was this the diligent record-keeping of a concerned coach? Or was it something more chilling? Was it the field notes of an intelligence handler, documenting the gradual psychological dismantling of their asset? This second set of books, if they existed, would be the Rosetta Stone to Marilyn's final days. One diary held the secrets she knew. The other held the secrets of how she was being controlled. The two books represent the two sides of the final, tragic battle for Marilyn Monroe. One contained her truth, her power, her secrets. The other contained the plan for how to neutralize them all, a weapon, and the user manual for its destruction. Paula Strasberg and Ralph Greenson always maintained they were trying to save Marilyn from herself. But looking at the evidence, a darker question emerges. Were they saving her? Or were they managing a crisis? A crisis not of Marilyn's mental health, but of the secrets she possessed. On the night of August 4th, 1962, the timeline of events becomes confused, contradictory. Phone calls are made, but the records are hazy. People arrive at the house, but their stories change over time. It's a chaotic narrative. But what if, underneath the chaos, there was a meticulous plan? What if Paula's logbook wasn't just a record of the past, but a set of instructions for the future, a precise chemical formula to induce a state of confusion, of despair, from which there would be no recovery and no press conference? The official story is that of a lonely woman who took her own life. But in this version of the story, she wasn't alone at all. She was surrounded by the very people she trusted most, who had spent years isolating her, medicating her, and perhaps preparing her for this final, silent exit. After Marilyn's death, Paula Strasberg inherited a significant portion of her estate. But more importantly, she inherited the narrative. She and Dr. Greenson became the primary architects of Marilyn's final hours. The secrets Marilyn knew, documented in her little red book, were buried. But the secrets of how she was controlled, meticulously recorded in another book, may have been the most dangerous of all. They were the blueprint for how to silence a star. That book, if it existed, has never been seen. Perhaps it was destroyed, its purpose served. Or perhaps it sits today in a forgotten archive, a cold, clinical epitaph to a life that was burned so brightly, and then so efficiently extinguished. In the end, we are left with a ghost, a beautiful, tragic icon whose death has become a modern myth. But behind the myth was a real woman, fighting a war she didn't even know she was in, against enemies she mistook for friends. The Boulevard of Broken Dreams is littered with stories, but none more haunting than that of the girl who knew too much, and the people who made sure she would never tell. The powerful have always hidden their secrets behind the headlines. To uncover more stories that have been lost to the shadows, subscribe to Boulevard of Monroe. The truth is waiting in the archives.